This is Math 6, Lesson 5-5, Subtracting Mixed Numbers. When you subtract mixed numbers, you may need to write the fractions with a common denominator. Then you can subtract the whole number and the fraction parts separately. Subtracting mixed numbers. You're going to find the least common denominator, rename both fractions using the least common denominator, find the missing numerators to make equal fractions, subtract, and then simplify as necessary. So if I have 11 3/4 minus 7 5/8, I'm going to rewrite these vertically because it's easier. 11 3/4 minus 7 5/8. My least common denominator here between 4 and 8, I know that 8 is my biggest number here, and 4 does divide evenly into 8, so my least common denominator is 8. So I'm going to rewrite 11 3/4 in terms of 8. 4 times 2 is 8, 3 times 2 is 6, so 11 3/4 becomes 11 6/8. I do not have to rewrite 7 5/8 in a common denominator because it already has the common denominator. Now I'm going to simply subtract the the whole number parts, and then I will subtract the fractional parts. So 11 minus 7 is 4. 6 minus 5 is 1. So 11 3/4 minus 7 5/8 is 4 1/8. So 4 1/8 is my answer here. 14 3/16 minus 7 5/8. Again, I need to find a least common denominator. My least common denominator here would be 16, because my largest number is 16, and I know that 8 divides into 16 2 times, so I know my common denominator then is going to be 16. So if I have 14 3/16 minus 7 5/8, I need to rewrite these fractions with the common denominator. So 14 3/16 stays. 7 5/8 has to change into 16ths. So I know 8 times 2 is 16, 5 times 2 is 10. So I now have 14 3/16 minus 7 10/8. And you might go, that's kind of weird. It is kind of weird. Because if you're looking at this number, I can subtract the whole number parts just fine, but I can't subtract the fractional parts. If you look right here, I have a 3 and I have a 10. I cannot take 10 away from 3. Okay? It's impossible for me to take 10 away from 3. Because if I asked you to give me $10 and you only have $3, you cannot give me $10 if all you have in your pocket or all you have in front of you is $3. And you can't give me an IOU because that doesn't work either. So when this happens in math, we have to do some things a little bit differently. Okay? We have to look at this and go, this is not working out the way I want. Because I can't do it. So we have to do something differently. Okay, we're going to come back to this problem in just a moment after we take a look at something in a second here. Since I can't take 10 from 3, I'm going to have to rename 7 10/8. To rename 7 10/8, okay, let's look at a picture first. Sometimes we need to rename whole numbers or fractions so you can subtract. So let's take a look at 3 1/4. I could show 3 1/4 in the following way. Let's say I decide to show 3 1/4. I'm going to, okay, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and I'm going to color in a 4th. So that's 3 1/4. Looks quite nice. It looks handy. Okay, that becomes 3 1/4. Now, there are other ways I can show 3 1/4 as well. I can decide to do something very similar here. And I can say, okay, I'm going to color in 1, 2, so much for me coloring in the lines, 3, and I can do a 4th again, but let's say I decide a little later on, I go, if I really did this, I could think of this being here like this. Right? I could put a cross in every one of these and break them up into 4 pieces. I could break them up into 6 pieces. I could cut them like a pizza, is basically what I'm doing here. So 3 1/4 could be 3 whole circles and 1/4 of a 4th circle, or it could be 2 whole circles. Okay, this becomes 2. This becomes 1, and this becomes a 4th. Okay, this 1 is the same thing as saying 4/4. So instead of renaming this as 3 1/4, it can be renamed as 2 5/4. Okay. So I can rename 3 1/4 as 2 5/4 because I colored in 1 whole red circle, a 2nd whole red circle, the 3rd whole red circle I broke into 4 pieces, so I colored in 4/4 of that, which is the same as coloring in 1 whole, and the 4th circle I have a 4th. So 3 1/4 is the same thing as saying 2 5/4. So let's go back to our problem over here, where we had trying to take away 10 from 3. I can't take 10 from 3. It's impossible to take 10 from 3. So I'm going to have to rename my second fraction here. So I'm going to keep my 14 3/16. I'm just going to write it down here. And my 7 10/8. Okay. Oops. It should be 10/16. I can't believe I made that mistake over there. Okay. I can't take 10 from 3, so I'm going to have to rename my 7 10/16. So I'm going to keep my, I don't have to rename my 7 10/16. I have to rename my 14 3/16. I'm going to keep my 7 10/16 just like this. But I'm going to rename 14 3/16. I'm going to borrow 1 from the 14. If I borrow a whole number from the 14, I'm going to make that 13. So I now have 13 16/16 plus 3/16 because I borrowed a whole number. 13 16/16 is the same thing as saying 14. So if I combine these, if I combine my 13 16/16 with my 3/16, that becomes 16 plus 3 is 19. This becomes 13 19/16. And now I have 7 10/16. So now I can take away 10 because I have 19 to take it away from. So now instead of subtracting 7 from 14, I'm going to subtract 7 from 13. And 13 minus 7 is 6. And 19 minus 10 is 9. So I end up with 6 9/16. And you may not understand this exactly. We'll go through a few more examples to make sure that you're understanding. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Okay. We're going to start with just renaming a whole number. If I have 5 and I'm going to subtract from that 3 2/3, I cannot subtract 2/3 from nothing. There's nothing here. I can't take 2/3 away from something that has nothing. Okay, that's like saying, give me 2/3 of $1 and you have no money. Okay, you can't give me anything if you don't have it. So I need to rename my 5 so that I can subtract from it. So instead of having a 0 here, I'm going to rename my 5. My 5 can be renamed as 4 3/3. And you might ask, why did you choose thirds? What's my denominator down here? It is 3. I want a common denominator, so I'll choose 3/3 because 3/3 equals 1. So I borrowed 1 from the 5 and it became a 4, and 3/3 is 1, so 4 3/3 is another fancy way of saying 5. So I now have 4 3/3, and I'm going to subtract from that 3 and 2/3. So 4 minus 3 is, I almost said 2, 1. 4 minus 3 is 1, and 3 minus 2 is 1. So 5 minus 3 and 2/3 is 1 and 1/3. Let's look at our next problem. 10 minus 4 and 1/4. Again, I can't take 1/4 from 0. And you can't just bring the 1/4 down and ignore the fact that there's nothing to subtract it from. So we have to rename the 10. If I borrow a 1, it becomes a 9. The fractional part I want has to have the same denominator as the problem on the bottom. So I'm going to borrow, and I get 4/4. So 10, you can rewrite 10 as 9 and 4/4. Because my denominator here was 4, that's why I chose 4/4. If my denominator would have been 12, I would have chosen 12/12. If my denominator was 128, I would have chosen 128 over 128. So now I'm going to take 9 and 4/4 and subtract 4 and 1/4 from it. 9 minus 4 is 5. 4 minus 1 is 3. So I have 5 and 3/4. It's not too bad when you have whole numbers subtracting a mixed number. It's a little bit more complicated when you got a mixed number subtracting with a mixed number. Now we're going to talk about subtracting mixed numbers with renaming. This is this problem like example 2 was at the beginning of this lesson. You're going to write the problem, find your least common denominator, rename both your fractions using your least common denominator, find your missing numerators. If the second fraction, not the fractional part, not the whole number part, is larger than the first fraction, you're going to have to rename the first fraction as a mixed number with an improper fraction. Then subtract and simplify if necessary. So let's take a look at some examples, and we're going to do quite a few. Because I figure the more examples that you see, the higher likelihood it is that you're going to understand this, because this can get confusing at times. So, let's take a look. 5 and 1/6 minus 1 and 5/6. This already has a common denominator. But if I look at this, I know I can't take 5 from 1. I can't subtract 5 from 1. So I'm going to have to borrow. So I have to rename the top fraction. So instead of making this 5 and 1/6, I'm going to borrow from the 5, and I'm going to make it a 4. I borrowed a whole number, so I borrowed 6/6. So 4 and 6/6 is another way of saying 5. I already had the 1/6 that was right here. So 5 and 1/6 can be written as 4 and 6/6 plus 1/6. Okay. Which means technically that becomes 4 and 7/6. I'm going to write that down here because I'm out of space up there. I'm going to subtract from that my 1 and 5/6. So if I have 4 and 7/6, and I'm going to subtract from that 1 and 5/6, 4 minus 1 is 3, 7 minus 5 is 2. So I get 3 and 2/6, but 2/6 reduces to 1/3, so this becomes 3 and 1/3. Hopefully by this time, you're able to reduce your fractions pretty much in your head. If not, show the steps on how you reduced it. Let's look at number 2. 9 minus 6 and 3/5. I cannot take 3/5 from nothing, so I must rename the 9. Another way of saying 9 in terms of fifths is 8 and 5/5. So I have 8 and 5/5, and I'm going to subtract from that 6 and 3/5. I have a common denominator, so I don't have to worry about that. 8 minus 6 is 2. 5 minus 3 is 2. So this becomes 2 and 2/5. It is much easier to subtract a mixed number from a whole number than it is to subtract a mixed number from a mixed number. There's one extra step when you're subtracting a mixed number from a mixed number. Let's take a look at 8 and 1/12 minus 7 and 5/12. We have the right common denominator, but I can't take 5 from 1. And due to the space here, I'm just going to rewrite this underneath so I have lots of space to work with. So I have 8 and 1/12 minus 7 and 5/12. So I'm going to have to borrow from the 8 and make it a 7 and 12/12 plus the 1/12 I already had. And I'm going to subtract from that 7 and 5/12. That now means that I have the following problem. I have 7, 12/12 plus 1/12 is 13/12. And I'm going to subtract from that 7 and 5/12. Okay, 7 minus 7 is 0, so I can just leave it alone. I don't have to put a 0 when I'm working with a mixed number. 13 minus 5 is 8. 8/12 reduces, divisible by 4. 4 goes into 8 twice. 4 goes into 12 3 times. And I end up with 2/3 as my final answer. Let's take a look at some more problems. 3 and 1/5 minus 1 and 3/4. These become more difficult because now I have to find a common denominator. So I don't even know if I need to borrow yet or rename, because of the fact that I don't have a common denominator. So let's look at this. The common denominator, least common denominator between 5 and 4, that is 20. So I need to rewrite these as 20ths. So I need to multiply 5 times 4 and 1 times 4, and this gives me 3 and 4/20ths. Here I need to multiply 4 times 5 and 3 times 5, so this gives me 1 and 15/20ths. Now I look at this and say I cannot take 15 from 4, so I'm going to rewrite 3 and 4/20ths down here, minus 1 and 15/20ths, and I am going to borrow. I have to rename the 3 and 4/20ths. I'm going to borrow from the 3 and make it 2, so I'm going to rename 3 as 2 and 20/20ths, plus the 4/20ths I already had. That becomes 2 and 24/20ths. Notice, if I add this number here to this number here, I get this number over here. If you understand renaming, if I rename 3 as 2 and 20/20ths, it becomes 2 and 24/20ths, because you just add your denominator to your numerator and put it over the denominator. So I have 2 and 24/20ths minus 1 and 15/20ths. 2 minus 1 is 1. 24 minus 15 is 9. And I end up with 1 and 9/20ths. Let's look at number 5. And I'm just going to erase part of number 4 so that I have space to work with number 5 and I don't confuse people. I don't want to have my numbers working into other numbers so that you can't see them. So I'm just going to erase this for just a minute. Okay, it was earlier in the video, so just go earlier to the video if you want to see it again. So I have 5½ minus 2 and 5/6. Least common denominator here is 6. So I need to rename 5½. 2 times 3 is 6. 1 times 3 is 3. So this becomes 5 and 3/6. And I have minus 2 and 5/6. I cannot take 5 from 3, so I must rename 5 and 3/6 is going to rename to 4 and 6/6 plus 3/6, which makes this 4 and 9/6. Remember, 6 plus 3 is 9. And I'm going to subtract from that 2 and 5/6. 4 minus 2 is 2. 9 minus 5 is 4. So I have 2 and 4/6, but 2 and 4/6 reduces. This reduces to 2 2/3. Problem number 6. I'm just going to move this problem down the page a little bit, because that way I don't have to worry about it trying to squeeze it into the space that I have. You probably have enough space in your paper to write your notes, but I need more space to work with this. So problem number 6 looked like this. 6 1/6 minus 1 3/4. So my least common denominator here. Let's see, out of 4 and 6, think about this for a minute. 6 times 2 is 12. 4 does divide into 12 evenly, so the least common denominator is 12. It's not 24. 24 would be a common denominator, but it wouldn't be the lowest or least common denominator. You always want to work with the least common denominator because you're less likely to make mathematical errors because the numbers will be smaller. So I need to multiply my 6 times 2, I need to multiply 1 times 2, and this becomes 6 2/6. I need to multiply by 4 by 3, so my 3 has to be multiplied by 3, so this becomes 1 9. Excuse me, 12ths, not 6. Wow, I'm terrible at this. This should be a 12 up here, and this is a 12 down here. I cannot take 9 12ths from 2 12ths, so I'm going to rename the 6 2 12ths to becoming 5 12 12ths, plus the 2 12ths I already had, which makes this 5 14 12ths. And I'm going to subtract from that 1 9 12ths. 5 minus 1 is 4. 14 minus 9 is 5. And I get 4 5 12ths. Hopefully by now you're beginning to pick up on these strategies that we're doing. And you might even be able to go straight from this part of the problem to this part of the problem. Okay? If you can do that at this point in time, that's okay. That means you're understanding how the fractions work a little bit better. Let's do 2 more examples. 7 minus 2 3/8. So 7 minus 2 3/8. So I can rename 7 as 6 8/8 because my denominator is an 8 on the bottom. And I'm going to subtract from that 2 3/8. 6 minus 2 is 4. 8 minus 3 is 5, so it's 4 5/8. Number 8. 8 3/10 minus 2 1/2. Notice how I rewrite these fractions vertically? It's just so much easier to deal with them when they're vertical because then you can show your work neatly. So my least common denominator here is 10. So I will leave my 8 3/10, and this multiplied by 5 and multiplied by 5, and I'm going to subtract 2 5/10. I cannot take 5 from 3, so I have to rename my 8 as 7 13/10, because it's 7 10/10 plus 3/10 makes 7 13/10, and we're going to subtract from that 2 5/10. 7 minus 2 is 5, 13 minus 5 is 8, so I get 5 8/10, but 8/10 reduces by 2. 2 divides into 8 4 times, 2 divides into 10 5 times, so this becomes 5 4/5. Hopefully, by the end of this lesson, you have understood how to rename fractions so that you can subtract them. You don't need to rename them when adding, only when subtracting.